The mountains of Afghanistan have witnessed countless battles, but none quite like this. When Staff Sergeant Maria Santos picked up her rifle that morning, she had no idea she would spend the next 18 hours as the only thing standing between 12 elite Navy SEALs and certain death. What started as a routine extraction mission turned into a nightmare that would test every skill she had learned in her 8 years as a Marine sniper. Surrounded by over 200 Taliban fighters in terrain that offered no mercy, Maria would have to make shots that defied possibility while coordinating a defense that military textbooks said was impossible. This is not a story about superhuman abilities or Hollywood heroics. This is about what happens when training meets desperation, when precision meets chaos, and when one person refuses to let good people die on her watch. It's about the longest 18 hours in Maria Santos's life, and how she turned the mountains that were meant to be her grave into her fortress. The enemy thought they had them trapped. They were wrong. The morning sun painted the Afghan mountains in shades of gold and amber as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted the scope on her M24 sniper rifle. 8 years of service had taught her to trust her instincts, and something about this mission felt different. The intelligence reports seemed too clean, too simple for a region where nothing was ever straightforward. Maria had grown up in a small town in Texas, where her grandfather taught her to hunt from the age of 10. By 14, she could hit a moving target at 500 yards with an old bolt-action rifle. When she joined the Marines at 18, her instructors quickly realized they had something special. Her natural ability combined with relentless training had made her one of the most accurate snipers in her unit. Mission briefing had been standard. Extract a high-value intelligence asset from a village in the Kunar province. 12 Navy SEALs would handle the ground operation while Maria provided overwatch from a ridge, approximately 800 meters away. The asset had information about Taliban supply routes that could save dozens of American lives. Simple in, simple out. But as Maria settled into her position on the rocky outcrop scanning the valley below through her scope, she noticed movement that wasn't in any of their intelligence reports. Small groups of fighters moving through the tree line, positioning themselves in locations that would create perfect ambush points. Her heart rate increased as she counted at least 40 fighters when intelligence had suggested no more than 10. She pressed the radio button on her throat mic. Overwatch to Alpha Team. I'm seeing significant movement in the valley. Multiple groups positioning for what looks like an ambush. How copy? The response came from Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, the SEAL team leader. Copy that, Overwatch. We're seeing some movement down here too. How many are we talking about? Maria continued scanning, her trained eye picking up details that would be invisible to most people. At least 40 confirmed, possibly more. They're setting up in textbook ambush positions. This feels like a trap. There was a pause before Morrison's voice crackled back. Roger that. We're committed to the objective. Intelligence says this asset is worth the risk. Keep us informed of any changes. Maria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. In her experience, missions that felt like traps usually were traps. But she understood the decision. If the intelligence was accurate, the information from this asset could prevent future attacks that might kill dozens of American soldiers and Afghan civilians. She watched through her scope as the SEAL team moved through the village below. They were professionals, moving with the kind of precision that came from years of training and combat experience. But even the best soldiers in the world could be overwhelmed by superior numbers in the right circumstances. The village itself was a collection of mud brick buildings arranged around a small central square. Most of the civilians had disappeared, which was never a good sign. In Maria's experience, when local civilians cleared out, it usually meant they knew something was about to happen. Through her earpiece, she could hear the team's radio chatter as they moved toward the target building. Alpha 2, you've got movement in the building to your right. Copy that, Alpha 6. I see it. Overwatch, can you confirm no friendlies in that structure? Maria adjusted her scope and confirmed the building was clear of civilians but couldn't see inside well enough to identify potential threats. The SEALs reached the target building without incident, but Maria's unease continued to grow. The Taliban fighters she had spotted earlier seemed to have melted away, which was even more concerning than seeing them in the open. Experienced fighters didn't just disappear unless they were preparing for something big. 20 minutes later, the SEALs emerged from the building with their asset, a middle-aged Afghan man who looked terrified but was cooperating. Maria watched their extraction route, scanning for threats along the path they would take to reach the helicopter landing zone 2 kilometers away. That's when she saw them. Taliban fighters were emerging from concealed positions all around the valley. Not 40, not 50, but what looked like 200 or more. They had been waiting,
hiding in caves and behind rocky outcrops, allowing the SEALs to complete their mission before springing their trap. Alpha Team, this is Overwatch. You've got multiple hostiles emerging from concealed positions all around your location. I count at least 200 fighters. You need to move now. Morrison's response was immediate and professional despite the dire situation. Copy that, Overwatch. We see them. Changing route to alternate extraction point. How's our path looking? Maria scanned frantically. Every route out of the valley was being covered by Taliban fighters moving into position. The alternate extraction point was 3 kilometers away, through terrain that would offer minimal cover. Even worse, she could see vehicles moving along the road that would cut off that escape route within minutes. All routes are compromised, she reported, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. They've got vehicles moving to cut off the alternate extraction as well. You're surrounded. The next few minutes unfolded with terrifying speed. The Taliban fighters began their attack. Automatic weapons fire echoing off the valley walls as the SEALs took cover behind the mud brick buildings. Maria could see muzzle flashes from dozens of positions as the enemy forces converged on the village. Morrison's voice came through the radio. Calm, but urgent. Overwatch, we need immediate support. Request close air support and emergency extraction. Maria was already on her backup radio calling for help, but the response was not what any of them wanted to hear. Negative on immediate air support. Closest assets are 40 minutes out. Weather is moving in fast. Extraction may not be possible for several hours. She looked at the sky and saw the storm clouds building over the mountains. In this region, weather could change from clear skies to zero visibility in minutes. If those clouds opened up, helicopters wouldn't be able to fly in the mountainous terrain. Through her scope, Maria could see the SEALs had taken defensive positions in and around 3 buildings in the center of the village. They were surrounded but had good fields of fire and solid cover. The problem was ammunition. 12 men, even elite SEALs, couldn't hold off 200 fighters indefinitely. Maria began engaging targets, picking off Taliban fighters who were trying to advance on the SEALs' position. Her first shot dropped a fighter who was setting up a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. The second took out a machine gunner who was raking the buildings with automatic fire. Each shot was carefully calculated not just for accuracy but for maximum impact on the enemy's ability to coordinate their attack. But she quickly realized that even her expert marksmanship wouldn't be enough. The Taliban fighters were experienced and well-equipped. They had mortars, RPGs, and what looked like enough ammunition to sustain a long fight. Worse, they were using tactics that showed they had planned this ambush carefully. They weren't just randomly attacking. They were systematically trying to overwhelm the SEALs' position from multiple angles. As the first mortar rounds began falling near the SEALs' position, Maria knew this was going to be the fight of her life. She had trained for situations like this, but training and reality were 2 very different things. In training, there were always backup plans and safety nets. Here, 800 meters away from 12 of America's best soldiers, she was their only immediate hope for survival. The radio crackled with Morrison's voice again. Overwatch. We're taking heavy fire from all directions. We've got 1 man down, non-critical. We need you to start thinning them out. Maria was already working, her rifle speaking with deadly precision every few seconds. But as she engaged target after target, more fighters seemed to appear from nowhere.
The Taliban had clearly planned this operation for weeks, possibly months. They had overwhelming numbers, prepared positions, and the advantage of knowing exactly where the fight would take place.
What they hadn't counted on was Staff Sergeant Maria Santos and her 8 years of turning impossible shots into reality. As the battle intensified and the weather began to deteriorate, Maria settled into the rhythm that had kept her alive through dozens of combat missions.
Breathe, aim, squeeze, breathe. 1 shot, 1 kill.
Over and over again until either help arrived or there was nothing left to save. The longest day of her life was just beginning. The sound of Maria's rifle became a steady drumbeat across the valley as she worked methodically through target after target. Her position on the rocky ridge gave her clear lines of sight to most of the Taliban positions, but it also made her increasingly visible to enemy fighters, who were beginning to understand that their casualties were coming from the mountainside. Through her scope, she watched the SEALs fighting with the disciplined ferocity that had made them legendary. They were using every piece of cover available, coordinating their fields of fire to create overlapping kill zones around their position. But Maria could see they were being pushed back, forced to consolidate into an increasingly smaller defensive area as Taliban fighters advanced from multiple directions. The weather was becoming a serious factor. Dark clouds had rolled in from the north,
and the first drops of rain were beginning to fall. In these mountains, rain meant visibility would drop to almost zero within minutes, and the rocky surfaces would become treacherous. For Maria, it meant her scope would fog up, and her ability to provide accurate fire support would be severely compromised. She keyed her radio. "Alpha Team, weather's moving in fast. I'm going to lose visibility soon. What's your ammunition status?" Morrison's response came between bursts of gunfire. "We're at about 60%. The asset is secure, but we've got 2 more wounded, both still combat effective. We need to move before they bring up those mortars." Maria had been watching the mortar team setting up in a depression about 1,200 meters away. It was at the extreme range of her rifle, but she knew that once they had their weapons dialed in, the SEALs' defensive position would become untenable. The mud brick buildings provided good protection against small arms fire, but they wouldn't stop mortar rounds. She adjusted her scope for the extreme range shot, accounting for wind speed and the slight upward angle. The first shot missed by inches, sending up a puff of dirt next to the mortar position. The Taliban fighters immediately began looking for the source of the shot, some of them pointing in her direction. Her second shot found its mark, dropping the fighter who appeared to be directing the mortar crew. The remaining crew members scattered, abandoning their weapon temporarily. But Maria knew they would be back once they figured out her position and found a way to suppress her fire. That's when she noticed movement much closer to her own position. A group of Taliban fighters had broken off from the main attack and were climbing the ridge toward her. They were still several hundred meters away, but they were moving fast and knew the terrain well. She was about to go from being a sniper providing overwatch to being in a fight for her own survival. Maria quickly assessed her situation. Her position was excellent for providing fire support to the valley below, but it was not designed for all-around defense. Behind her was a sheer cliff face that dropped nearly 1,000 feet. To her left and right, the ridge was too narrow and rocky to provide good movement options. She was essentially in a dead-end position, with enemies approaching from the only direction that offered access. She had 2 choices: abandon her position and try to find another location from which to support the SEALs, or stay and fight from where she was. Moving would mean leaving the team without sniper support during the most critical phase of the battle, and it might take her an hour or more to find another position with good fields of fire. Staying meant she would have to fight a close-range battle against multiple opponents while simultaneously trying to continue providing long-range support to the SEALs. The decision wasn't really a choice at all. 12 Americans were fighting for their lives in the valley below, and she was their lifeline. Maria began preparing her position for close-quarters combat while continuing to engage targets in support of the SEAL team. She pulled out her M4 carbine and placed it within easy reach, along with several fragmentation grenades. Her pistol was already on her hip. If the Taliban fighters reached her position, she would transition from precision shooting to the kind of close-range combat that Marines train for constantly. Through her scope, she could see the SEALs were under increasing pressure. Taliban fighters were advancing on their position from 3 sides, using covering fire from machine gun positions to get closer to the buildings. Maria began targeting the machine gunners, knowing that eliminating their covering fire would slow the advance. Her shots were finding their marks, but for every fighter she eliminated, it seemed like 2 more appeared. The Taliban had clearly committed significant resources to this ambush. This wasn't just an opportunistic attack. It was a carefully planned operation designed to capture or kill an entire SEAL team and their intelligence asset. The rain was becoming heavier, and Maria could feel her scope beginning to fog slightly. She wiped the lens quickly and continued engaging targets. But she knew her effectiveness was going to diminish rapidly once the weather fully moved in. The Taliban fighters approaching her position were now close enough that she could see them without her scope, moving carefully from rock to rock as they climbed toward her. Morrison's voice came through the radio again, and this time Maria could hear the stress in his tone. "Overwatch, we're taking heavy casualties. 3 men down now, 1 serious. We need immediate extraction or we're not going to make it." Maria pressed her throat mic while lining up another shot. "Air support is still 20 minutes out. Extraction is weather dependent. I've got hostiles approaching my position, but I'm staying put to keep providing support." She didn't mention that staying put might mean fighting to the death. The SEALs had enough problems without worrying about her situation. Her job was to provide fire support for as long as possible, regardless of the personal cost. Her next shot eliminated a Taliban fighter who was setting up what looked like an anti-tank weapon.
These weren't just local fighters with old AK-47s. The equipment she was seeing suggested this was a well-funded and organized operation, possibly involving foreign fighters with military training.
The approaching Taliban fighters were now close enough that Maria could hear them calling to each other in Pashto. She estimated they would reach her position within 10 minutes. She had to make a decision about when to transition from sniper support to close-quarters defense.
Through her scope, she watched as the SEALs conducted what appeared to be a fighting withdrawal into the largest building in the village. It was a good tactical decision. The building had thick walls and multiple floors, which would allow them to create overlapping fields of fire while reducing the number of directions from which they could be attacked. But Maria also knew that once they were trapped inside a building, their mobility would be severely limited.
If the Taliban brought up those mortars or used RPGs effectively, even the thickest walls wouldn't provide protection for long. She began engaging targets with increased urgency, trying to eliminate as many threats as possible before she would be forced to defend her own position. Each shot was carefully placed to have maximum impact on the enemy's ability to coordinate their attack. She targeted leaders, heavy weapons operators, and fighters who appeared to be directing others. The Taliban fighters climbing toward her position were now close enough that she could see their faces. They moved with the confidence of men who knew they had her trapped, taking their time to ensure they wouldn't walk into an ambush themselves. Maria counted at least 8 fighters, possibly more. Behind the rocks where she couldn't see them, she made one more radio call to the SEALs.
Alpha Team, I'm about to have company up here. Going to be off the radio for a while, but I'll keep providing support as long as possible. Morrison's response was immediate.
Negative, Overwatch. If you're compromised, fall back to alternate position. We'll hold until air support arrives. Maria smiled grimly as she lined up what might be her last long-range shot for a while. Sorry, sir. Marines don't abandon their positions. You concentrate on staying alive down there. She squeezed the trigger and watched through her scope as another Taliban fighter dropped. Then she reached for her M4 carbine and prepared for the fight that would determine whether any of them would see the next sunrise. The approaching fighters were less than 50 meters away now, moving carefully but steadily toward her position. Maria could hear them coordinating their attack, surrounding her small rocky outcrop to attack from multiple angles simultaneously. They knew she was trapped, and wounded animals were always the most dangerous. What they didn't know was that Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had never been just a sniper. She was a United States Marine, trained to fight and win regardless of the odds. As the first Taliban fighter appeared around the rocks to her left, Maria's war was about to become very personal indeed. The first Taliban fighter rounded the rocky outcrop with his AK-47 raised, scanning for Maria's exact position. He never got the chance to fire. Maria's M4 carbine spoke twice in rapid succession, and the fighter collapsed behind the rocks where his companions couldn't immediately see what had happened to him. Maria knew she had perhaps 30 seconds before the other fighters realized their point man was down, and adjusted their tactics accordingly. She used that time to reposition herself behind a larger boulder that would provide better protection from multiple angles of attack, while still allowing her to observe the valley below. Through quick glances with her binoculars, she could see the SEALs had successfully consolidated their position in the large building, but Taliban fighters were closing in from all sides. Muzzle flashes erupted from windows on multiple floors as the Navy SEALs fought to hold their defensive positions. She needed to get back to providing sniper support, but first she had to deal with the immediate threat to her own position. The second Taliban fighter appeared around the right side of her position, moving low and fast. Maria's training kicked in automatically. She didn't think about the shot. She just made it. The fighter went down, but not before getting off a short burst from his rifle that sent chips of rock flying dangerously close to her head. Now the remaining fighters knew exactly where she was positioned. She could hear them calling to each other in Pashto, coordinating what sounded like a simultaneous attack from multiple directions. Maria counted voices and estimated at least 6 more fighters still approaching her position. She pulled a fragmentation grenade from her vest and carefully calculated the timing. When she heard footsteps approaching from her left flank, she pulled the pin, counted to 3, and threw the grenade in a high arc that would bring it down behind the rocks where the fighters were taking cover. The explosion sent rock fragments and debris flying in all directions, and Maria heard screams of pain from at least 2 voices. But she didn't have time to assess the damage because fighters were approaching from her right side simultaneously. Maria spun around and engaged 2 Taliban fighters who were rushing her position with knives drawn, clearly intending to take her alive if possible. Her M4 dropped both of them at close range, but their sacrifice had bought time for their companions to get closer to her defensive position.
A burst of automatic fire from an unseen position shattered the rock face inches from her head, sending sharp stone fragments across her face and drawing blood from several small cuts. Maria wiped the blood from her eyes and tried to locate the source of the fire while staying behind cover. The radio crackled with Morrison's voice, and she could hear intense gunfire in the background. Overwatch, what's your status? We're taking heavy fire down here and really need your support. Maria pressed her throat mic while scanning for the next threat. Still in the fight, Alpha Team.
Give me 2 minutes to clean house up here and I'll be back on Overwatch. She didn't mention that 2 minutes might be optimistic. The Taliban fighters had her surrounded and were systematically eliminating her cover options. Each position she moved to exposed her to fire from a different direction, and she was running low on places to hide. Another fighter appeared at the edge of her vision, and Maria's rifle found him before he could bring his weapon to bear. But as he fell, she realized she was down to her last magazine for the M4. She would have to make every shot count, or transition to her sidearm and fight at even closer range. Through a gap in the rocks, Maria caught a glimpse of the valley below. The SEALs were still holding their building, but Taliban fighters had advanced much closer to their position. She could see muzzle flashes from basement windows, indicating the enemy had gotten close enough to fire into the lower floors. The situation was becoming desperate.
She made a quick decision that would either save the mission or get them all killed. Instead of continuing to fight defensively against the Taliban fighters attacking her position, she would go on the offensive and try to eliminate them quickly so she could return to providing sniper support.
Maria pulled her last grenade and threw it toward the largest concentration of voices she could hear. As soon as it exploded, she moved aggressively toward the blast area, with her M4 ready, hoping to catch any survivors off guard. The tactic worked. 2 Taliban fighters who had been stunned by the grenade explosion were trying to regain their footing when Maria appeared around the rocks. Neither of them had a chance to raise their weapons before her rifle eliminated both threats, but her aggressive movement had exposed her to fire from the remaining fighters, and a burst of automatic fire caught her in the left shoulder, spinning her around and sending her rifle flying across the rocks.
Maria hit the ground hard, her left arm immediately going numb from the impact. She rolled behind the nearest cover she could find, which was barely large enough to protect her torso, and drew her M9 pistol with her good hand.
Blood was flowing freely from her shoulder wound, and she could feel her strength beginning to fade from blood loss. 2 more Taliban fighters rushed her position, clearly believing she was finished. The first one paid for that assumption with his life as Maria's pistol found its mark despite her awkward shooting position. The second fighter managed to get close enough to kick her pistol out of her hand, but Maria still had one more weapon available. She drew her combat knife with her good hand and rolled toward the fighter's legs, cutting behind his knee and dropping him to the ground. They struggled briefly in hand-to-hand combat before Maria was able to finish the fight with her blade, but the effort left her exhausted and bleeding heavily. As silence fell around her position, Maria realized she had eliminated all the fighters who had been approaching her location. But the victory had come at a significant cost. Her left shoulder was badly wounded, she was losing blood, and she had used most of her ammunition in the close quarters fighting. She crawled back to her sniper rifle, which fortunately had not been damaged in the firefight, and tried to assess the situation in the valley below.
What she saw made her heart sink. During the time she had been fighting for her life, the Taliban had managed to get much closer to the SEALs building. There were now fighters on rooftops adjacent to the building, and she could see what looked like preparation for a final assault. Maria tried to steady her rifle for a shot, but her wounded shoulder made it nearly impossible to maintain the precision she needed for long-range shooting. The pain was intense, and blood loss was making her feel lightheaded. But 12 Americans were fighting for their lives below, and she was still their only immediate support. She managed to line up a shot on a Taliban fighter who was setting up what appeared to be an RPG on a nearby rooftop. The shot was not as clean as her usual work, but it found its target and eliminated the immediate threat to the SEAL's position. The effort left her exhausted and shaking from blood loss. Morrison's voice came through the radio again, and this time she could hear desperation creeping into his professional tone. Overwatch. We're running low on ammunition and they're preparing for a final assault. How much longer until air support arrives? Maria checked her watch with difficulty, her vision starting to blur slightly from blood loss.
15 minutes, she managed to say into her throat mic. You need to hold for 15 more minutes. She didn't mention that she wasn't sure she would be conscious for 15 more minutes, let alone able to provide effective fire support. The wound in her shoulder was worse than she had initially thought, and she was losing blood faster than she had hoped. But Maria Santos hadn't survived 8 years of combat by giving up when things got difficult. She had ammunition left for her sniper rifle, and as long as she could hold the weapon steady, she could still make a difference in the fight below. She forced herself to focus through the pain and blood loss, settling into her shooting position once more. 12 American lives depended on her ability to keep fighting regardless of her personal condition. And Maria Santos had never failed her fellow Marines when they needed her most. Maria pressed field dressing from her medical kit against her shoulder wound, using her teeth to help secure the bandage with her good hand. The bleeding slowed but didn't stop completely. She knew she was working against time now. both the approaching air support and her own body's limits. Through her scope, she watched Taliban fighters positioning themselves for what appeared to be a coordinated final assault on the SEALs building. They had learned from their earlier attempts and were now using proper military tactics, suppressing fire, movement under cover, and coordinated timing. These weren't just local fighters anymore. Someone with real military training was directing this attack. Maria identified the most critical targets and began engaging them despite the pain shooting through her shoulder with each recoil. Her first shot eliminated a fighter who appeared to be using hand signals to coordinate the attack. Her second dropped a machine gunner who was providing covering fire for advancing fighters, but her shots weren't as precise as usual. The combination of blood loss, pain, and an unstable shooting position was affecting her accuracy. Shots that would normally be instant kills were instead wounding targets, requiring follow-up shots that consumed precious ammunition. Morrison's voice crackled through the radio with increasing urgency.
Overwatch. They're bringing up explosives.
Looks like they're going to try to breach the walls. We need immediate support on the south side of the building.
Maria shifted her position to get a better angle on the south side, grinding her teeth against the pain as movement aggravated her shoulder wound. Through her scope, she could see Taliban fighters carrying what appeared to be improvised explosive devices toward the building where the SEALs were trapped. Her first shot at the lead explosive carrier missed by inches, the bullet striking the wall behind him. Maria cursed and quickly chambered another round, knowing that if those explosives reached the building, the blast would either kill the SEALs outright or create breaches that would allow the Taliban to overrun their position. The second shot found its mark, and the explosive device detonated prematurely, taking out not only the carrier, but several other fighters who had been advancing with him. The explosion was larger than Maria had expected, suggesting the Taliban had access to military-grade explosives rather than just homemade devices. But even as she celebrated that small victory, Maria could see more fighters approaching with additional explosives from different angles. The Taliban had clearly planned for the possibility of losing some of their explosive teams and had prepared backups. She began engaging targets as quickly as she could work the bolt on her rifle, no longer taking time for the careful precision that had defined her earlier shooting. Speed was now more important than perfection. She needed to disrupt the coordinated attack before the sheer number of enemies overwhelmed the SEALs' defensive position. Her rapid fire was having an effect.
Taliban fighters were taking cover and hesitating to advance, clearly aware that approaching the building meant exposing themselves to her rifle. But Maria knew she couldn't maintain this pace much longer.
Her shoulder was bleeding through the field dressing, and the constant recoil was making the wound worse with each shot. Through her earpiece, she could hear the intensity of the firefight in the building below. The SEALs were engaging targets on multiple floors, and from the sound of the gunfire, the enemy had managed to get inside the building on at least the ground floor. Morrison's voice came through the radio, and for the first time, Maria could hear real fear beneath his professional composure. Overwatch. They're in the building. This is the book. It's about history. We've pulled back to the second floor, but we're running out of ammunition and places to retreat. How long until air support? Maria checked her watch again, struggling to focus through her deteriorating condition. 8 minutes, she managed to say. Can you hold for 8 minutes? There was a pause before Morrison responded, and Maria could hear explosive charges going off in the background. We'll do our best. Keep those explosive teams off us if you can.
Maria was down to her last few rounds of rifle ammunition, and her vision was starting to tunnel from blood loss. But she forced herself to focus on the most critical targets.
2 more Taliban fighters were approaching the building with explosives, moving carefully but steadily toward what appeared to be a structural weakness in the south wall. Her shot dropped the first fighter, but the second managed to reach the wall and place his explosive device before Maria could line up another shot. She watched helplessly as the fighter retreated to what he thought was a safe distance and prepared to detonate the charge. With no time for a careful shot, Maria aimed for the explosive device itself and squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck the device just as the fighter triggered the detonator, causing a massive explosion that brought down a section of the wall but also eliminated the fighter and several of his companions who had been too close to the blast. The explosion created a breach in the building's defenses, but it also bought the SEALs precious time by eliminating several attackers and causing the others to hesitate before advancing through the debris and smoke.
Maria chambered her last round and scanned for the most critical targets she could find. Taliban fighters were regrouping for what would clearly be their final assault, and she could see movement in multiple locations around the building.
She had 1 shot left to make the maximum possible impact on the enemy's ability to coordinate their attack. Through her scope, she identified what appeared to be the Taliban commander, a figure in different clothing who was directing fighters from a position behind the building. He was at extreme range and partially concealed, but Maria could see enough of him to attempt a shot. She steadied her rifle as best she could with her wounded shoulder and lined up what would be the most important shot of her career.
If she could eliminate the commander, it might disrupt the attack long enough for air support to arrive. If she missed, the SEALs would face a coordinated final assault, with no sniper support.
Maria controlled her breathing, fought through the pain and blood loss, and squeezed the trigger one last time. Through her scope, she watched the Taliban commander collapse and immediately saw confusion ripple through the attacking forces as fighters looked around for new leadership.
But her victory was short-lived. Without rifle ammunition, Maria could no longer provide effective long-range support, and she could see Taliban fighters beginning to advance on the building from multiple directions. The SEALs were about to face their final battle, and she was powerless to help them. She picked up her radio with her good hand, knowing this might be her last communication with the team.
Alpha Team, I'm out of rifle ammunition. You're going to be on your own for the next few minutes until air support arrives.
Morrison's response was immediate and characteristically professional despite their desperate situation. Copy that, Overwatch. Thanks for everything you've done. We'll see you on the other side. Maria knew what that meant. The SEALs were preparing for a last stand, expecting to fight to the death rather than be captured. She looked at her pistol, which still had ammunition, and made a decision that surprised even her. Instead of staying in her sniper position and waiting for the inevitable, Maria Santos decided to join the fight in person. She was a Marine, and Marines didn't abandon their brothers in arms. If the SEALs were going to make a last stand, they wouldn't do it alone.
Maria gathered her remaining ammunition and began the dangerous journey down the mountainside toward the village. She was wounded, exhausted, and outnumbered by at least 20-1. But she had never walked away from a fight in her life.
In the distance, she could hear the sound of approaching helicopters. Air support was finally arriving, but whether it would be in time to save any of them remained to be seen. What Maria knew for certain was that she would be fighting alongside her fellow Americans when the final shots were fired. The sound of approaching helicopters grew louder as Maria made her way down the treacherous mountainside, using rocks and sparse vegetation to control her descent while trying to avoid detection by Taliban fighters who might be watching the ridgeline. Her shoulder throbbed with each jarring step, but the sound of those rotors gave her strength she didn't know she still possessed. She could hear the battle intensifying in the village below.
The distinctive sound of SEAL weapons mixed with the chatter of AK-47s and the occasional explosion as the Taliban fighters pressed their final assault. Maria knew that every second counted now. The helicopters were close, but whether the SEALs could hold out long enough for air support to be effective was still an open question.
As she moved down the mountain, Maria could see the tactical situation more clearly. The Taliban had concentrated most of their forces around the building where the SEALs were trapped, but they had also positioned fighters to watch for exactly the kind of rescue operation that was now approaching. She could see at least 2 machine gun positions that would have clear fields of fire at any helicopters trying to land in the village.
Maria made a decision that would either save the mission or get her killed in the attempt. Instead of continuing toward the building where the SEALs were fighting, she began moving toward the nearest machine gun position. If she could eliminate or disrupt those anti-aircraft weapons, it would give the incoming helicopters a much better chance of successfully extracting the team. The first machine gun position was set up in the ruins of a building about 300 meters from the main battle. 2 Taliban fighters had positioned their weapon to cover the most likely helicopter landing zones, and they were scanning the sky as the sound of rotors grew louder. Maria approached the position from behind, using the noise of the battle to cover her movement.
Her left shoulder was barely functional, but her right hand still worked fine, and she had her M9 pistol loaded and ready. At 20 meters, she could hear the fighters talking excitedly in Pashto, clearly aware that helicopters were approaching.
She moved closer, using the rubble of the destroyed building for cover until she was within 10 meters of the machine gun position. The fighters were focused on the sky and the approaching aircraft, not watching their rear approach.
Maria knew she would have one chance to eliminate both fighters before they could turn their weapon on her or signal for help. Her first shot dropped the gunner instantly. The second fighter spun around in surprise, but Maria's follow-up shot found him before he could raise his rifle. She quickly moved to the machine gun position and confirmed both fighters were dead before turning the weapon toward the second anti-aircraft position she had identified earlier. The heavy machine gun was a Soviet-era weapon that Maria wasn't completely familiar with, but the basics were similar to American crew-served weapons. She quickly figured out the firing mechanism and began engaging the second machine gun position, which was approximately 400 meters away across the village. Her fire was effective enough to force the second machine gun crew to abandon their position and seek cover, eliminating the immediate anti-aircraft threat just as the first helicopter appeared over the ridgeline. Maria could see it was an Apache attack helicopter, its weapon systems already active and scanning for targets. The Apache pilot had clearly been briefed on the situation because the helicopter immediately began engaging Taliban positions around the building where the SEALs were trapped. The 30mm chain gun and Hellfire missiles made quick work of the concentrations of fighters that had been preparing for their final assault. But Maria could see that Taliban fighters were adapting quickly to the changed situation. Some were retreating to covered positions where the helicopter couldn't engage them effectively, while others were setting up shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles that could pose a serious threat to the rescue helicopters. She spotted a fighter with what appeared to be a Stinger missile moving into position to engage the Apache. The fighter was too far away for her pistol to be effective, but Maria knew she had to do something to warn the helicopter crew or eliminate the threat. She keyed her radio and tried to contact the Apache directly.
Apache 1, this is Overwatch. You have a Stinger missile team setting up at your 2 o'clock, approximately 600 meters from the target building.
The Apache pilot's response was immediate. Copy that, Overwatch. I see the threat.
Breaking off and coming around for a gun run. Maria watched as the Apache maneuvered to avoid the missile while simultaneously engaging the fighter with its chain gun.
The Stinger team was eliminated, but Maria could see at least 2 more shoulder-fired missiles being prepared in different locations. The situation was becoming a deadly game of cat and mouse as Taliban fighters tried to position their anti-aircraft weapons while the Apache crew worked to identify and eliminate threats before they could launch their missiles.
Maria realized she could play a crucial role by providing ground-level intelligence about enemy positions that might not be visible from the air. She began moving through the village using her radio to guide the Apache toward threats while avoiding Taliban fighters who were now actively hunting for the source of the intelligence that was helping the helicopter crew.
Her shoulder wound was bleeding again from the exertion, but adrenaline and determination kept her moving. Through her earpiece, she could hear Morrison's voice coordinating with the helicopter crews.
Apache 1, we're ready for extraction. We have 1 KIA, 4 wounded, and the asset is secure.
We need immediate dust-off. Maria's heart sank at the news of a SEAL fatality. But there was no time to dwell on losses. The extraction helicopters were approaching, and she could see Taliban fighters moving to intercept them with RPGs and machine guns that had survived the Apache's initial attack. She spotted a team of fighters setting up an RPG position that would have a clear shot at the extraction helicopters as they approached the landing zone. The position was close enough for her pistol to be effective, but attacking it would certainly expose her to return fire from multiple directions. Maria made the same decision she had been making all day. The mission and her fellow Americans came first. She advanced on the RPG position, using cover as effectively as possible, while moving fast enough to reach them before they could engage the incoming helicopters. Her first shot eliminated the RPG gunner, but the loader immediately grabbed the weapon and tried to bring it to bear on the approaching helicopters. Maria's second shot dropped him as well, but not before his dying fingers squeezed the trigger and sent a rocket-propelled grenade streaking toward the lead extraction helicopter. The Apache pilot saw the threat and engaged the RPG with his chain gun, but the grenade was already in the air. Maria watched in horror as the projectile tracked toward the helicopter carrying the crew that would extract the SEALs and save all their lives. At the last second, the helicopter pilot saw the incoming round and executed a violent evasive maneuver that sent the aircraft sliding sideways through the air. The RPG missed by inches, exploding harmlessly against the mountainside behind the helicopter. The extraction proceeded quickly after that. The Apache continued to suppress Taliban positions while 2 Blackhawks landed near the building where the SEALs had been trapped. Maria could see the team moving toward the helicopters, carrying their wounded and their intelligence asset. But she also realized that in her focus on supporting the extraction, she had exposed her own position to multiple Taliban fighters who were now converging on her location. She was trapped in the middle of the village with enemies approaching from several directions and nowhere to run. Maria keyed her radio one last time as she prepared for her own final battle. Alpha Team, this is Overwatch. Packages away, mission complete. It's been an honor serving with you. Morrison's voice came back immediately. Negative, Overwatch. We're not leaving without you. Mark your position for extraction. Maria smiled despite her desperate situation. She should have known the SEALs wouldn't abandon her after everything they had been through together. She marked her position with a smoke grenade and prepared to hold out until help could reach her. The Blackhawks lifted off with the SEAL team and their precious intelligence asset, but the Apache remained on station, hunting for Taliban fighters who might threaten Maria's position. As enemy fighters closed in on her location, the helicopter's chain gun began systematically eliminating threats around her defensive position. Minutes later, one of the Blackhawks returned for her, touching down just long enough for Maria to sprint across the open ground and dive through the open door. As the helicopter lifted off and headed for safety, Maria finally allowed herself to believe they had all made it out alive. The intelligence asset they had extracted provided information that prevented dozens of future attacks and saved countless American and Afghan lives.
Maria's actions during 18 hours of continuous combat earned her the Navy Cross, making her one of the most decorated female Marines in history. But for Maria Santos, the real victory was simpler than any medal could represent.
12 Americans had been trapped and outnumbered by overwhelming odds, and not one of them had been left behind. In the end, that was all that really mattered.